Now I believe we can do everything else for Chapter 6 in one last video, so let's take a look at these items. First of all, there are two types of threats with bring your own devices. First is an incoming threat and then an outgoing threat. Let's go first with the B here. This is the incoming threat. Mobile devices can simply bring malware into our network, and so we have to make sure we've mitigated for that. Now let's take a look at A, and this is data getting out. First of all, somebody brings their own device, they connect to our network, they do their work all day long, and now they've got data on their device that we do not want to get out into the wild. But we don't have any control over that device once it's out of our network. And so that's the second type of threat. And again, we have to make sure we've mitigated against that. Now let's take a look at attacks at various levels of the OSI or the TCP/IP models. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. These are simply an example at each layer, but let's take a look at those. At layer 7, that's the application layer. So here up the application layer, we have, for example, web pages going back and forth. And we could send out multiple HTTP requests and flood a server and try to get that server to shut down or to give up its credentials, for example. At layer 4, the transport layer, we can do, for example, SYN floods. A SYN flood is simply opening up a lot of connections but not acknowledging those. So now the receiving device has a whole bunch of requests for connections, but they're just sitting there and they never get acknowledged, and so those connections never happen until you finally overwhelm the thing. At the network layer, we can do something called a ping flood or a Smurf attack. They're both very similar. There's a slight difference in how they are carried out, but this is simply overwhelming a network, or I should say overwhelming a server or a device with too many ping requests. If you want to see the difference or know the difference between a ping flood and a Smurf attack, I'll leave it up to you to look at them. Maybe use an AI engine. That's a good use for an AI engine to explain the difference. Layer 2, the data link layer, MAC address spoofing is a very real threat there. MAC address spoofing simply means looking like the MAC address of another device on that network. Layer 1 physical layer, typically signal jamming, denial of service attacks, for example, or simply disconnecting wires or disconnecting something so that everything kind of shuts down. Last, we have Wi-Fi unauthorized access mitigations. This is particularly talking about those cases where we have a public Wi-Fi system and we want to keep ourselves protected from malicious activity on our public Wi-Fi system. One thing we can do is network cloaking. That's simply not advertising your SSID. It doesn't keep down the sophisticated players, but it does keep down just casual finding of your network. And the other thing we can do is something called a captive portal. This is where we intercept the request to log on to our network, but our servers generate a logon requirement. And the servers can use a database so that only certain people can have access, or it can simply capture information about the user and require that they check a box for their terms of usage and so on. Captive portals are not a function here of the Wi-Fi. They're a function of the server on that network behind that Wi-Fi. Well, that's it for Chapter 6 for our videos this week, and I hope to see you next week in Chapter 7.